So when you're cutting dovetails, the first thing you've got to do is mark out the tails. Welcome to Woodworking Skills for Beginners video with me, Sean Evelegh, where we're going to be cutting a through dovetail. The tools you'll need are a crosscut saw, a dovetail saw, a bevel edge chisel set, a mallet, a fret saw, a marking gauge, a marking knife, a square, a dovetail marker, a rule and a pencil. As you might know, dovetails are probably the most famous joint in the world. They're commonly used in cabinetry, boxes and drawers. They're very decorative, but they also have a lot of strength. Because of that dovetail shape, you can't pull the pieces apart. So when you're cutting dovetails, the first thing you've got to do is mark out the tails. So I'm going to put the tail board into the bench vise. I've got a pencil and a ruler here. I always start the first tail about 5 to 6 millimeters from the edge. You want the outside pins to be thicker than the internal ones because there's no supporting material on the other side, so these are quite weak. Now the distance between these two marks I made is 9 centimeters, so I'm going to divide that by 3 and put a mark at 3 and 6. The internal pins, I want the top of them to be 4 millimeters, so I'm going to measure 2 millimeters either side of that mark. Now I'm going to get my square and mark out those lines. Now my dovetail marker is a 1:8 ratio. I think 1:8 looks the best in my opinion, but it's totally personal preference. So get whichever ratio you like, and I'm going to draw these lines on the front of the board. You can do this on the back as well if it will help you cut straight. And I'm just putting my pencil in line with that mark I made on top, butting up the dovetail marker and drawing that line. Okay, now with through dovetails, these tails can either protrude past the pin board or you can make it flush. So I'm going to make it flush. I'm going to get my marking gauge, reference it off the surface of the material, drop the marker down to the bench top and tighten that. So now that is set to the exact same thickness as the board. And I'm going to run that on the shoulder edge, across the full back of the tail board. Do a small pass to begin with, a light one, and then go deeper. And on the front side, I'm not going to drag the cutter across the whole surface of the material, because then I'm going to get a line in the final result, in the final joint, and that will be a lot of work cleaning up that line. So I'm just going to mark the waist, so I won't need to worry about sanding or planing the surface later to remove that mark. And I'm going to be very careful not to go over the pencil line. Just gently rolling the wheel back and forth. Okay. Now I'm going to put it back into the bent vise. Because this is a thin bit of stock, I have got a fine tooth dovetail saw. If it was thicker, I'd go for a lower TPI, about 14 TPI. This is 20. This is going to give me a nice fine cut on this thin board. So I'm going on the waist side of the line, touching the line, but on the waist side. make sure you don't cut too far and go past that marking line. We're now going to switch over to the fret saw. A fret saw is like a coping saw, but it's got a thinner blade, and that's going to fit nicely into that curve we just cut. And I'm going to remove the waste in the 2 pins in the middle. I'm going a millimetre above that marking line. Now, if you don't have a crosscut saw, you can do this next step with a dovetail saw, a rip saw, but because I have a crosscut one here, I'm going to use it, and I'm going to go again a millimetre off this line and pair back to it with a chisel. Okay, so now the tails are roughed out, I'm going to clamp this to my workbench and then use a chisel to pair back to that marking line. So what I'm going to do now, to help me mark out the pins, I'm going to add a little lip to the back of the tailboard, but just using a chisel and cutting into that marking gauge line. Now that lip is going to help this board engage, you can hear that. So when I put it in the vise, I'll know that the shoulder line is meeting the edge of that pin board exactly, and then I can mark out the top of the pins. So let's put the pin board into the vise. I've got a plane here to help me hold the tailboard. I'm going to raise this pin board up though, bit higher than the plane, so then the lip can lock on. I'm going to get my largest chisel to help me align the 2 boards. And push down on that, get my marking knife, and very carefully transfer the line. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is get a pencil and a square and carry on those lines down to help me cut straight. And then I'm going to get my marking gauge that is still set to the same thickness as the material. You don't need to mark these outer walls because we want to keep the pins on. I'm just going to mark the full back. And the waist area on the front. Remember not to go over the pencil line. Okay, so now it's time to remove the waste. So I'm going to put the pin board back into the vise, making sure that the face side is towards me. And then I'm going to get my dovetail saw and I'm going to cut on the waist side of the line. I'm just going to mark the waist to help. Make sure that the piece is square in the vise. If you're not comfortable cutting to the side of the line, you can cut slightly off it and then use a chisel to pare back to that line. But I'm going to cut just on the line on the waist side of it. Okay, so now the rip cuts are made, I'm going to use the fret saw to remove that waste in the middle. I'm going to go 1 millimeter off the baseline. Okay, like before, I'm going to clamp it to the workbench and then use a chisel to pare back to that baseline. So the pins are now cut. To help the tails sit nicely in there, I'm going to add a tiny chamfer on the back. Remember not to start the chamfer from the front, because you'll see that in the final joint. You want to start the chamfer about 2 or 3 millimeters into the tail, like that. And that's going to help the tails locate better. It's going to give a place for the glue to go, and also if there's any loose sawdust or fuzz left in the joint, it's going to help the tails seat properly. So let's give it a test fit. So that's come together very nicely. What I'll do now is I'll take the joint apart, put some glue in there, and that is the joint complete. So I'm using some Type on 1, and I'm going to add the glue to all the surfaces. If there's any gaps, then hopefully the glue will swell the wood grain and fill that in. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'll leave this to set overnight and then we'll come back to see what it looks like. So that is the Through Dovetail, one of my favourite joints. This one has come out very nicely with no gaps. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Remember to like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.